moderator for today, and we are very, very honored today to have Ms. Ruth Pagel come and speak to us on World University Rankings, how to be #1. So I'm going to just say a few words about our speaker, and then I'll yield the floor to her. Okay, so first of all, she's been a practicing librarian, a university library director, a library school educator, and a speaker for many years. In addition to an MLS, she also has an MBA. She worked in library leadership positions at the University of Pennsylvania and Emory University, and she was the founding librarian for the Li Ka-shing Library at Singapore Management University. She's taught library information science courses at many different universities, both in the United States and in Singapore. And in addition to having lived in Singapore and Thailand, she has written and she speaks at conferences all over the world. She's a co-author of International Business Information, How to Find It, How to Use It. I love subtitles like that are so energetic. And her most recent interest has been in bibliometrics and university rankings. So she has a chapter in a book by Springer on bibliometrics and university research rankings, Demystified. She also regularly writes a column that is called Ruth's Rankings, and it is available in Access newsletter. And she began writing in 2014, and her most recent posting was just this month. So please join me in welcoming this very expert speaker.
Aloha. I'm delighted to be here, and I really want to thank Ms. Diana Chan and HKUST for inviting me. I'm especially proud to be at a school that's already #1. Oh, now wait a second. Let's back up, because while this is posted as how to be #1, and we're going to talk about the characteristics that make a #1 university, I hope that by the end of this session, instead of thinking about being #1, I want you to think more about being best and what's best for you, your institution, and your users. And it might not be these rankings. So this is in some ways a complicated topic. It has a lot of different threads that run through it, and this is a linear talk, but it's really not a linear topic. So, and I know I have people in the audience with very mixed information about bibliometrics and rankings. So to begin with, we'll do a brief history of bibliometrics and rankings. And then we'll talk about the different players. There are a lot of different players. We'll do basics on metrics, and one of the different things about this talk is we're not only going to talk about bibliometrics, but we're going to look at those other indicators that are part of the rankings, which have nothing to do with bibliometrics. We'll talk about the major rankings and their indicators, and we'll look at different slides so we'll know the differentiation among them, and they're more than the big three that you're familiar with. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the main driver, which is happening now, which is higher education as global big business and the impact that's having on universities. And we'll take questions at the end. So I was asked to talk a little bit about how I became an expert. And in some ways, how I became an expert mirrors the whole evolution of how rankings got to be where they are now. I went to library school, and my first academic library jobs were in the city of Philadelphia in the United States. And for those of you who are older, you might be familiar with the Institute for Scientific Information, the parent of the Web of Science. So my universities were just a few blocks from Web of Science. And that started in 1961, this rather weird genius, Eugene Garfield, was looking at how faculty were doing research and how you had to go through journals and pull out citations. So he created the concept of Science Citation Index. And the important thing to keep in mind was that Science Citation Index was designed for one author, one article, individual research. And we've taken that as the bedrock for something that we are now ramping up to ranking countries. So, you know, you have to think about how scalable the whole concept is. So I've been using bibliometrics for a very long time. Yeah, let me do the different threads. We started working with faculty probably while we were still at Penn, individually, because nobody wanted to use those old books anyway, and helping them on their individual research. And as time went on, we became more involved with working with departments, because faculty were then being evaluated for hiring, tenure, promotion, using the bibliometrics. And at a department level, it made sense because we were looking at like objects or like people. When I got to Emory, we got more involved with working with the faculty. And at Singapore Management University, we were in a very good position. We were new, so we just told them we were going to help them, because it was the same time that Singapore put in its quality QAFU framework. And they didn't give us many rules, so we probably broke all of the rules. But all of the staff worked individually with faculty to give citation metrics to be used at a country level. Now, at the same time in my history, I started writing articles about rankings about 30 years ago. I'm interested in numbers, I'm interested in rankings, and my editor said, don't talk to them about numbers, you're too interested in numbers, but I don't know how you can talk about rankings and not talk about numbers. So I did a lot of writing and included rankings. In 1989, I went to Thailand to work there for a year. And it's hard to believe because it doesn't seem that long ago, but in 1989, people were saying to me, you're so brave going abroad. I mean, I didn't think I was brave. I like Thai food, you know. But when I came back, I suddenly became an expert in international business because I'd been abroad. And so people asked me to write a book, and we wrote a book about international business. And one of the things we focused on was international data. And this doesn't come up very much when we're talking about rankings, but something else to keep in mind is organizations like the United Nations, OECD, IMF, all have trouble when you're dealing with international data and international definitions. And these are things we just don't discuss when we're looking at the rankings, particularly the part of the rankings where universities submit their own information. After I came back, I ended up going to Emory University, to their Goizueta Business School. And it was a small business school, very well known in the South, but not well known anywhere else because it didn't have sports teams and it wasn't on TV. And so the question, every time we had a staff meeting, the question was, how can we improve our rankings? Because a lot of this in the beginning was driven by business schools, that they were very much into rankings before anyone else was interested in rankings. You know, so it was something that was on my mind even then. Then at SMU, when we were doing all of the work with faculty, we were working closely with Thomson Reuters because ISI had become Thomson Reuters during the process. And until 2004, they were the only game in town. There was nobody else. If you were looking for bibliometrics, you had to use Thomson Reuters. And I had worked with them closely in the US, and I had worked with them closely in Singapore. And every year they sent somebody to Taiwan to a library information conference to talk. So they asked, and they started working with HIAC, which is their evaluation committee, who were doing rankings at the time that have now been taken over by National Taiwan University. So they asked me if I would go and give a talk and talk to HIAC and talk about bibliometrics and university rankings. So then I became an expert. So as I said, a lot of people are involved in this. And there are a lot of different players. And the group we tend to forget about are the students. And I think one of the problems with the rankings is they take emphasis away from the students. But we wouldn't be here if there weren't students. So we have to keep that in mind. We also wouldn't have rankings if there weren't faculty, because you can't have citations if you don't have publications. So you need one to have the other. And everybody has different needs and different interests. So as I mentioned, we then worked up to the school and department level. Then faculty and institutions were asked to be more accountable. So you had your KPIs and more pressure was put on, and now we're looking at an institutional level. Important to know your institution's vision, mission, and goals in terms of what you should be looking at. And then government policy and funding became involved in rankings, and they kind of embraced the numbers. So the information goes up, the information comes down. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. Each of these rankers do not go out and collect their own information. I mean, it's just not feasible. So as I said, until 2004, the only place you could get your information was from, at that point it was still ISI, because it was bought out by Thomson Reuters a couple of years later. And now it's part of an investment firm, which makes me very nervous, called Clarivate Analytics. And they have a whole suite of products. So most of you are familiar with Web of Science, and they have the 3 citation indexes: science, social science, and arts and humanities. Arts and humanities is like Cinderella, only they never got their slipper to fit right. And then they have some Asian language, 2 Asian languages and a Russian index as well. In 1976, they started journal citation reports. So when somebody says write in an A journal, that was again the only game in town that you could use. They then added something called essential science indicators, which is the top 1% in your field. And with in 2014, they put in an analytical product called Insights. So a lot of the data is coming from these sources in the scholarly rankings. That's what they're using. And of this whole suite, there's only one thing that's free, and that's a list of highly cited researchers. I think Elsevier was watching what was going on and decided that there were a lot of complaints about what was happening with ISI, that it was too narrow, it wasn't including enough journals, it wasn't embracing developing countries. So Elsevier started with Scopus, which is their version of Web of Science. It's one package. They started in around 2006, and in the beginning they didn't have that many years, and they've been going further and further back. To differentiate themselves from Web of Science, they added twice the number of publications, which means you're getting a whole lot more citations as well. And especially newer universities that weren't from the Western countries, prefer Scopus because you're going to get more citations. And just recently, again, they put in their own analytic tool, which your university library just bought, which is SciVal. So now we have 2 products. And they have a free journal ranking site that everyone can get to, which it's not even a year old yet. Now there are other sources, of course, of bibliometrics, Google Scholar. not going to get into Google Scholar during the talk. We can very much, I mean, we can talk about it later under questions. And there is one ranker that is beta testing different ways of using Google Scholar for rankings. But in the end, when you're asked to publish, if you're not publishing in a journal that's in Scopus, or a publication that's in Scopus, or a publication that's in Web of Science, it's not going to be reflected in the rankings. So there's, we're at an interesting time now in the history of academics and publication, where on one hand it's open access, but it's also rankings, and the two have not come together. So this is just an example of what you would see if you were using Insights, because this is the raw data. This is where the rankers are getting their data from. And they give a variety of sources. And this is something to keep in mind for those of you from Hong Kong UST, is that you're small. And this is going to keep coming up as we talk. So you have fewer documents, fewer citations, but you've got higher impact when you're looking at things that aren't the numbers, just the totals. And this is an example of SciVal. Another reason people like SciVal is it's much nicer visually. And now, I'm not a visual person at all, so I'm fine with tables. But a lot of people like to see things visually, and they do a much better job visually. And this is showing that your most publications, citations, are coming out of the field of engineering. Another thing to keep in mind as we go through this. So in addition to the big three, there are a lot of ranking organizations out there. So the big three, the ones that everyone talks about, are QS, Times Higher Education, and ARWU, Shanghai Rankings. So let's just talk a little bit about each one of them, and after we go through Webometrics, we're going to look at each of them as well. So in the first one was Shanghai University. Actually, at that point, it came from Shanghai University, and that was 2003. And they started doing rankings because of mainland China's initiative to create world-class universities. So they wanted to know, what did world-class universities look like from a metrics perspective? And that's how they got into the rankings game. And at the same time, the UK, which, as you know, was always doing rankings exercises, they were rethinking their rankings exercises, and somebody wrote a paper about universities being more involved in industry, and they wanted to see a different set of metrics. So in 2004, Times Higher Education, which of course is a publication, and QS, which is a consulting firm, got together and came up with a different set of rankings. And as we go through this, you're going to see that the metrics they use are very different. Now, in around 2010, they divorced, and each one of them has their own ranking as well. But in addition to them, there are a lot of other rankings up here. And some of them are consulting and research labs, some are publishers, some are university affiliates. They all have their biases based on where they're coming from. Something to keep in mind as well. So there's a group out of Spain called Simago, and I'm not sure if that's really pronounced, but they do rankings and they do journal rankings as well. And they're also into the Webometrics and doing beta testing. And we can see that QS and Times are mass market. Their target audience are students and parents. And yesterday I was talking to just a small group of faculty at City University in linguistics. Now talk about an area that has problems getting citations. It's something like linguistics. And they ask, well, how do they make money? Well, they sell all kinds of spin-offs. So the rankings are kind of a come-on. And then they try to sell you all kinds of other things. U.S. News and World Report. Now they're another one of the group of people who get blamed for all of this, because they actually started doing U.S. rankings in 1983. And people are still complaining about the impact it has on U.S. education. There's so many other things that are wrong with U.S. education, there's no need to blame U.S. News. But they got into the game very late, and they've only been doing it for, this is their 4th year. Nature decided to come out with its own index, but of course you've got to realize that Nature is very small, narrow subject rankings. They have a ranking. There's another research group out of Layton University, and that's the Layton rankings, and we're going to look at those because I personally happen to like one of the couple things that they do. And then HEAC became National Taiwan University, and all they rank are papers. So it's important to know what it is that each one of these rankers are really looking at and how they fit in with what you need. And then there were a lot of complaints, so the EU decided to come out with something themselves, and from my perspective, it's worse than any of them. And Asia and the US don't participate. So so we're not even going to talk about it, but it is out there in case somebody mentions it, and if you want to know more, you can ask me later. Okay. When I was doing these slides, I wasn't sure how I should say which should you believe, which is best, which is most relevant. We settled on believe, and this is where we got way off track yesterday, so we're not going to, we're just leaving believe right now. So which should we believe? Which is the world's #1 university? What do you think by looking at this? Do you feel comfortable saying anything? I mean, if I asked you, who would you say is the world's #1? Harvard, yeah. So that looks pretty secure. You know, and I'm sure some of you have never even heard of Rockefeller University. No, we'll talk about that when we talk about Layton. It only teaches graduate students. And some of the rankings don't even include universities that only teach graduate students. But then we come to Hong Kong UST. These are some of your rankings. Which do you believe? I know which one you like best. So this is the same university, same set of metrics, and you can be #1 or you can be number 347. And maybe #1 isn't the best ranking, and number 347 is certainly something you don't like. But this is what you have to keep in mind when you're looking at all of these rankings, that they are using same data sets, very different weightings of what's important. And what's important to them and what's important to you might be two completely different things. Okay. And what's important to you needs to be in the context of HKUST. You know, each individual university needs to look at its own vision and its own mission, and keep that in mind when you start evaluating these rankings. So the vision is, you know, visions are kind of big picture, but the mission is very clear. The mission says that you want to be strong in science, technology, engineering, management, and business studies. And that's something you need to keep in mind when we get into the nitty-gritty of each one of the different rankings. Because you're not saying you want to be great in everything. You know, you want to focus on certain subjects. So what are these metrics that we're talking about? Well, first of all, the bibliometrics, and we'll look at those first. Publications. As I said, you can't have citations if you don't have publications. Even publications can be defined in different ways. So when you look at the rankings, they might say publications, they might say articles, they might say documents, they might say papers. Are they the same things? Not always, because some of them don't include books. Poor books. Books don't get very well represented in this at all. Yeah, it's pretty sad. And even certain type of articles are more heavily ranked. So not even all articles are included in some of the metrics. Then of course we have citations. Everybody focuses on citations. How many citations? But it's not only how many, but it's what impact do they have, because all citations are not created equally. We've got the journal impact factors, and that's, you know, again, your A journals. Is it better to publish in an A journal? Well, actually, the rankings, they don't know, as long as it's in Web of Science or as long as it's in Scopus, they don't know if it's an A journal or not. It's just a journal that's represented there. So that's more at an evaluation level, at your department level. And then collaboration is the newest thing that's been added. And whom do you collaborate with? And in some cases, it's more important is where the university is, not how good it is either. Because international collaborations are better than local collaborations, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So generally, the focus is on institutions at this level, but countries are now being ranked as well, because if we're looking at global business and higher education being part of the global business market, then countries are also using the same metrics to evaluate a country that they would a department. And then we have the level of individual authors, and that's only important in making sure that you're mapping the right author to the right university and the right department. And in the beginning, that was a real problem because Web of Science only used initials. Yeah. And we know with Asian names, initials aren't going to get you anywhere. When I did my talk in Taiwan, I found 2 faculty with the same family name, same initials in the same department. Okay, now the different measurements, and there's a lot of, like every other field, there's jargon here. So we've got some jargon that we need to talk about. And one of the most important things is the difference between size dependent and size independent. Because if you're a big university, you've got a lot of publications, lots of citations, you're going to do well in some of the rankings because they're looking at total numbers. If you're HKUST, or many of the universities here in Hong Kong, you're already at a disadvantage when they're looking at size-dependent numbers. You're not big. I mean, you can only do what you can do. And in the beginning, there was a lot of controversy about this. So there were bibliometricians, and that's a rather new term as well. That 1969 was the first time that was ever used, who started doing research on different ways to measure citations, which would take into account things like size and subject. And these measures are size independent. That's why you see something like Rockefeller University. So it's a percentage or a ratio rather than a total number. Look at top 10% in a particular subject, top 1%. And then there are weighted counts because subjects aren't similar. So you'll see the field weighted citation impact because, again, in the beginning, every citation was counted the same. Well, there are certain areas where there are more citations in a month than some fields get in a year. So they have been working on ways to take this into account when they are doing citation counts. And again, it depends on the ranker what you're going to see. So one of the rankings now counts anything in social sciences twice, because there's so many fewer citations in social sciences than you're going to get in science. So this is normalization, where they take into account the differences among disciplines, and even in some cases, the differences among countries. And then the last thing is fractionalized counts. You've written an article with one of your colleagues at Hong Kong UST, somebody in China and somebody in Singapore. Does it get counted twice in Hong Kong? Does that article get counted 4 times? Or does every author get 1/4 of it? So that's one of the things that some of the rankers are looking at as well, whether you're going to count. And so there are articles that have over 100 authors. No, seriously, and that's been a real challenge for the rankers in terms of how do you handle that? I mean, does one article appear 100 times, and what kind of impact does that have? So they're still working on how to manage that. And of course, we have more situations where more than one faculty are writing articles, because now you're supposed to collaborate. I'm sure some of you remember the days when you weren't supposed to collaborate. You know, and if there were more than 2 authors, it was, oh, this must not be a good article. So now, you know, the more the merrier. So the question I'm asked, of course, is how do you increase citations? And there is no magic answer. Obviously, if you publish more, you will have more citations. You know, that's just the way it is. Reviews and articles are better than books and conference proceedings. Collaborate more. And it's good to collaborate with US authors, because even though the US is going down, they still are way at the top. And English is, you know, the language. You've got to publish in journals that are indexed in Scopus or Web of Science if you want to get credit for them. But make the articles as widely available as possible so people know they're out there. You know, and in some cases you can put the whole article up, but you know, just let as many people know that you're writing these things. What's also important for those of you who are faculty is to use a consistent name. And there are many tools out there now that help you. You know, we've got ORCID, we've got Mendeley, we've got Researcher ID, we've got ResearchGate, Google. In all of those places, use your complete name, keep it the same. I know we had problems at SMU to begin with, where sometimes faculty wrote with their Chinese names and sometimes they wrote with their English names. And people couldn't match them. Also, be sure to include your complete affiliation, because when we get to subject rankings, they need to know what department you're coming from. So every time you write, you know, be sure that you're doing whatever it is, that the same thing. Okay, having said that, well, we'll just look at this slide first, and you can see that in general, more publications, more citations. Number of authors don't make that much difference. Also, even though these schools have a lot of citations, have a lot of publications, a lot of authors, it doesn't mean that they're not English language, so they're not getting the citations. And this is one of the things to keep in mind with China. I mean, China is, you know, every time you turn around, they've leaped many degrees in the rankings, but not when it comes to size-independent rankings. But they will catch up eventually. You know, this just shows that, for those of you who are visual, this is about the best I could do, the relationship between publications and citations. Okay, guys, this is the misconception. Everybody thinks that citations are the way to improve your rankings. Well, believe it or not, they are not the only way to improve your rankings. And in some of the most popular rankings, they play a very small role. So, first of all, you've got to get into a ranking before it even matters if you have citations or not. None of these rankers use citations as your ticket to entry. They all use something else. So QS looks at papers and Scopus. Times higher education, you have to teach undergrads, which is why you never see Rockefeller, you won't see the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And they have a minimum number of articles that you have to publish over a certain year period, and they even have a minimum per year before you get in there. And you can't just be a one-subject school. ARWU looks at articles in Nature, Science, and the Science and Social Science citation indexes. The other rankers, US News uses reputation and publications, and Layton uses, again, they're the only ones who specifically use arts and humanities as well. So just keep that in mind when you're worrying about how do I improve my citation count. There are other things that are impacting your rankings that have nothing to do with citation count. Surveys, very questionable, but QS and THE put a lot of emphasis on surveys. 50%, 50, of the QS rankings are based on reputation surveys. So right off the top, you've got to be, that's what they're looking at. THE only has it about 30-something%, but of the over 1,000 universities that they rank, only 100 of them get a reputation rank, which means if you don't have a reputation rank, you're already losing 30% of your score. ARWU uses these Nobel Prize winners. Well, how many Nobel Prize winners are there in the world each year? You know, and how quickly does that number change? Not very quickly. So again, you don't have, of the top 100 universities, only 7 do not have a Nobel Prize winner or a field medal winner in math in their ranking. And then Webometrics is taking a whole different approach, and they're looking at web pages. But all of these things are kind of somewhat out of your control. There are things that are in your control. And this is where a lot of questions come in terms of, well, are universities manipulating the rankings? Maybe, maybe not. You get a questionnaire, right, that you have to fill out every year. And the library staff tomorrow is going to be looking at a questionnaire that comes from Times, which I was able to get from them. So you get a questionnaire, and they ask you certain questions that you fill in. An interesting metric is faculty-student ratio, because we already said that 50% of the QS rankings were reputation. 20% more, 20% are faculty-student ratio, and they use that as a surrogate for teaching. Now, I'm not exactly sure how faculty-student ratio impacts on teaching. And one of these things, again, when we're talking about international data in general, is who's faculty, who's student? How do you define a student? And they're asking for FTEs. Well, when you went from 3 years to 4 years, did the way you calculate FTEs change? Because you needed different credits. And different, one of the faculty yesterday was from Finland, and they have a completely different model. So if you read Times instructions, they say people who only do researchers, postdocs, PhD students aren't counted, but all of their postdocs, all of their PhD students, all of them teach. You know, so how do you really count who's teaching, who's not teaching? So just thinking again about QS, your favorite, we have got 70%, and we haven't even talked about citations. Citations are 20% of QS's rankings. That's it, 20%. They're 30% of Times THE's rankings. They're all these other things. Now, when I was doing research for this, I always look at international faculty, international students, because that's always put the US at a disadvantage. We don't have a Commonwealth. You know, we've got a country that's bigger than some continents, well, it is a continent, but we don't have a Commonwealth, and as things are going now, we're going to be even worse when it comes to international students and faculty. But what I learned in doing this research for this talk specifically is that international is an ambiguous term. So I wrote to the different rankers who include this, and I said, well, I'm giving a talk in Hong Kong. What about Chinese students? Are they considered international? The answer is yes, because they have a different passport. So they're crossing a border. Well, that's to your advantage. I mean, don't laugh at it. It's really to your advantage. But when it comes to international collaboration, they're getting their data from Web of Science or Scopus, and they do not consider mainland China international. So going back to my original example of writing an article with somebody from mainland China and Singapore, so if you write an article and collaborate with someone from mainland China, it's not considered international. If somebody from Singapore writes an article with that same faculty member, it's international. Now, not everybody counts collaboration internationally, but it is in PhD and QS. So you just have to keep that in mind. And then there are these other things like industry income and research income. So these are all part of the rankings. Not citations. So let's take some time out now and talk about the different rankers and why you would use one rather than the other. So this is QS, and you have your academic reputation, citations. They have a longer list of metrics that you can see. And the nice thing about this is if you click on academic reputation, for example, it will re-rank. But a lot of these rankers have a composite score. So in addition to the rankings, we have to keep in mind the score. And sometimes you don't know how they come up with the score. And you have to keep in mind what the weight for the score is. And we've already been talking about weights. So and what's happening, the trend in rankings is, the very first one in 2004 had 200 universities. Now they have 1,000. So they keep adding universities because everyone really wants to be part of this. But a lot of the new universities just end up on the bottom, and the same universities are at the top. It doesn't make much difference in the top. They include citations. It's normalized, so at least that's a good thing. And you can see that they have spin-offs. And in the spin-offs, you have different rankings for Hong Kong UST, depending on the spin-offs. And so two things I like about this is that you can re-rank, and their spin-offs have not only different weightings, but different metrics. So that's a good thing that they do. Maybe the only good thing they do. They're not my favorite, I'm sorry. When I write, I'm very careful, but I'm not writing today. Scoring. People never look beyond the rankings to the scores. You know, you say, oh, I'm number 1, that's wonderful. But now I'm number 2, and that's terrible. Well, look at the difference between NTU and NUS, which flip-flopped from one year to the next. 10%, 0.1%. I mean, how different is it? How many articles would you have to write? Or how many citations do you have to have? Or how many international students, to make these rankings change? So it really is important to look at the scores. And it's important for those people above you to understand that there's more to the rankings than the number. And maybe, faculty-student ratio, that's something HKUST doesn't do well at. But is that important to you? Or citations, are other things more important to you? Because this is their weightings, not your weightings. So this is something really important to keep in mind. So this is Times. Now what they do, which is pretty sneaky, is that they will say they have a teaching metric and a research metric, but there are sub-metrics in between that are included. So part of the teaching metric is a survey and part of the research, but you don't see the data for those. And I think most people don't even know what's included in them because they don't show you. So all of these are aggregates. So their international outlook is students, faculty collaboration, all put together. They now are up to 1,102 rankings. Both QS and TAG use Scopus as their base, and they're normalizing as well. And citations are 30%, and they have, I think, a small percent for number of publications as well that's hidden under research. And again, HKUST has different numbers in the different spin-offs. So another thing that happens, same rank, same score. Are the universities the same? Are these two universities the same? Well, obviously not. Yeah. You know, so, but if you're just looking at the rating, and I'm not sure who's more happy to be tied with whom in this situation. You know, so NYU has a much better citation score. But they're not doing much, well, neither do much with international outlook. So you've got to look at, another reason to look at the scores. You know, they're not the same. Just because they've got the same rank, and there you see a lot of ties, doesn't mean that they're the same. And in fact, when we get into ARWU, only the first 100 even get an individual rank. First they lump 50 together, and then they lump 100 together. So here's ARWU. And they, for the first time, now one of the nice things about it, even though it's so hard to get a good ranking, is that up until this year they were consistent. It was 500 universities from 2003 up until their last rankings, and they added 300 more on the bottom. So now they're acknowledging 300 more. No arts and humanities. It's all science. And the only thing they do with citations is the number of highly cited articles that come out of essential science indicators. So most of the scholarly rankings, now that we're getting to scholarly rankings, use the Web of Science data for their bibliometrics. UST has had the same ranking, 201 to 300, since the inception of this ranking. You have no way of knowing if you're really, you know, if in the beginning you were 300 and now you're 201. You just don't know. It's kind of the same. There was an article I just read very recently about this lumping together and what's a significant difference, because we saw that it would be hard to say it was a significant difference out of QS. And what they do here is they say that there's something like 10 degrees in scoring differential, and they don't feel that based on their metrics that's enough to give somebody an individual rank. So they just lump them together. But you really have no way of using this as a benchmark. The nice thing that they have been doing is they've been increasing the number of subjects. Subjects are important. And notice the subjects where you're doing well. You know, so you might be 201 to 300 in the overall ranking. You're in the top 50 of the subjects that you have identified as your important subjects. You know, so this is something to keep in mind. This is important, or it should be important. They will also include a university in the subject ranking that is not ranked at all. So SMU, Singapore Management University, which is really struggling to go anywhere in the rankings, is ranked under economics and business in ARWU. this year they added, I think, 20 different engineering fields. Because of course that's what's so important in China. I mean, that's where they're spewing out all of their documents. So in this case, when we look at distance and scoring, we have a completely opposite case. I mean, Harvard is so far above anybody else, it's hard to think that anyone's going to ever be able to catch up to them. So, you know, in one ranking, they're so close together that it's insignificant. In another, the metrics that they're using and the weightings they're using make it impossible for some of these universities to ever rise. U.S. News, an advantage that they have starting so late is that they use a mix of both size-dependent and size-independent rankings. So they'll say total number of citations or percent of citations who are in the top something percent. So you're kind of getting a balance of both. And I think people are a little confused about what they do because you're so used to their US rankings, which are always student numbers, student input, student output. They actually are a scholarly ranking. That they do have reputation, everything else is bibliometrics from Web of Science. And it's hard to use because you don't see anything across the top where you can compare schools one at a time. But if you go into a school, they will give you a lot of individual information because they even pick, oh, somebody missed, you all missed the spelling mistake. Okay, that must be books and conference papers. I can't tell you how many people have looked at this and not noticed that. Okay, and again, UST, not in the top 100 for total out, but the subjects that matter, you're up there. Now this is a very different ranking. This is the Layton ranking. They do not provide you with a composite score. They have publications, they have citations that are in the top 10% of their field, and they have publications that as a percentage of the top 10% of their field, which is the size-independent metric. And if you go to size independent, then again, UST is 68. But in terms of publication, they're 371. So this is the kind of difference it can make when you take into account the size. The other really nice thing about this ranking is they are the only ranking that provide you with real raw data. You can download their data set and play with it yourself, and it's Web of Science data. It's pretty clunky because it's multiple years, multiple subjects. But if you have, you know, I'm sure you obviously have people who can do something with that data. So if you don't get insights yourself, this is a way that you can get that data set and do it because you've got the raw data that they're using. So I happen to like it because it gives a completely different perspective, and you can say, you know, you can put different weights on these things or just say, no, I'm only interested in the percent of documents in the top 10%, because that's what's important to me as a smaller university. This is the Spanish group, and the interesting thing about this, for those of you who might be from a small institution, is that they rank almost 3,000 universities, and they also include other institutions that are doing research, because of course not all citations are coming from universities. You know, a lot of them are coming from research institutions. One of the interesting differences between Hong Kong and Singapore, and the article is about both of them, is that a lot of Singapore's publications and citations are coming from these research institutes. In Hong Kong, they're mainly coming from the universities. So if you're a small university, you're a new university, this is a way that you can start getting into the rankings. And then Webometrics has over 20,000 institutions. So another way you're going to see people, and sometimes they're just useful for benchmarking if you're starting out. I mean, that's how ARWU started out, it was benchmarking. So they have well over 20,000. And they're interested in open access, which is why they're focusing on Webometrics. And one of their theories is that a university's web presence, or a question they ask is, does the university's web presence match their bibliometric presence? Nature takes all comers. Whoever happens to have published in Nature during the time period that they choose gets a rank. And this is, they use fractionalized count. So there are more things too. I mean, older universities just do better. This is 19 out of 20 universities founded before 1900 are in the top in ARWU. One of the first US rankings was in 1925, and they ranked 19 universities, and 17 of those are in the top 100 and still in the top 100 of the world today. You know, so age matters. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. As those of us who are getting older now. Another thing that matters is time. We didn't talk about time when we were talking about citations, but when they're looking at citations, and in general when looking at publications, each of the rankers use their own time periods. You can't choose the time period that you want to have ranked. So it could be 5 years of publications, but then when it's citations, it's often current year publications and 2 years back of citations. Well, for those of you who aren't in fast-moving fields, 2 years, I mean, nobody's even read your article yet. No, so there are just so many things that are not accounted for yet in the rankings. So yes, age counts. Type of publication counts. Review articles have the most, they cite the most people and they're cited the most. You know, you're a PhD student doing research. You've got to cite one of these articles, right? Or they think you haven't done your research. So, for conference papers. Now, a good thing about Scopus is they cover conference papers very well. Web of Science does not. So engineering schools would be doing a disservice if they were not looking at Scopus. Subject, as we mentioned before, subject really matters. Where are most of the citations coming from? Life sciences and medicine. Where are most of your citations coming from? Engineering. And you know, it's just a fact of life. It is what it is. You can't do much about it. Because particularly that's where you say these are the things that are important. And look at poor arts and humanities. So this is just getting into subjects. This is another way of looking at subjects. This is the highly cited papers, and it's the number of documents, the number of citations. Now, it doesn't always mean that it's going to be the most cites per paper, but if you're looking at numbers, again, you know, clinical medicine is what nobody's close. They were talking yesterday, this is, don't tell anybody, at City U about setting up a veterinary school that the government's not funding. And the theory was, from my poor group of linguists, was they were doing that because then they would start getting biomedical articles. And it would help them in the rankings. Lots of limitations. We've already talked about the limitations in the rankings. You know, there are only a certain number of universities are ranked. You know, only 100 can ever be in the top 100. There are fixed time periods. We've got this composite rank that's based on weightings that might not be of interest to you at all. The updates are annual, So Layton comes out in March, and US News comes out at the end of October. When we were doing rankings of companies, and some companies, the UK companies, had annual reports that came out in March, and the US came out in December. A lot could happen in between that would have an impact on the numbers. So annual isn't always the best way. You're not getting the score, you don't look at the scores, and if you get the scores, you don't know what makes them up anyway. And it's a fixed set of publications. So there's a whole lot that you cannot do with the rankings that you are seeing. So again, this is just to remind you that there are other people who are writing and doing research, and there are sources where you're going to find, you've got to go back to the raw data for the best coverage of non-universities. So there are new metrics. Looking at views and usage. So it's not now how many times you cited, but has somebody looked at this? And looking at is defined different ways. Elsevier just came out with its new site score. And then we have social media and things like Webometrics and Plum Analytics, a whole other discussion topic about whether or not these should be included in scholarly rankings. So this is Scopus, and it's most viewed. And they're trying to put the same metrics on viewing something as they put on citing something. Is it relevant? Is it not? I don't know. I can't answer that question. If you go into Web of Science, it will now give you a usage count. And this I do know, because I talked to the Web of Science agent. Usage means that someone has either added it to their checklist, which doesn't mean, your friend's written an article, so you check it off and say, I've used it, or you've downloaded it, which is an abstract. So you had to do something with it, but you might never have looked at it again. So we're now looking at usage. This is Site Score. This is the competition to Journal Citation Index, and they use two other rankings as well. Layton does one, and SJR does one, and they include many, many more journals. So if you're interested in the journals in your field, you don't have to subscribe to JCR anymore, unless you feel more comfortable with their ranking system. Then we have the social metrics. So Nature uses Webometrics. Is it important for you to be in the news? I don't know. It probably is important to be in the news, but it's not going to help you in your rankings right now. And Elsevier just bought Plum Analytics. It's been around for a few years, but it wasn't very well known. But now they have added it to Scopus. You can add it to your own repository if you want. So Lingnam, in their institutional repository, you will see something that looks like this as well for all of their articles. Okay, now the most important piece today is the geography of research and the importance of geopolitics. Now, I didn't feel that uncomfortable being an expert in bibliometrics because I knew about metrics and I like numbers. And that's what all the original research was. But now the research is in higher education. And the article I wrote before this one was about geopolitics. And I have to admit, I was way outside my comfort zone in looking at geopolitics. But this is where the field is going. It's been taken out of your control. And it's in the hands, in many cases, of government, who are looking at this as ways of expanding their presence on the international stage, because it is big world business. The days when one university, you stayed there all your life, it's gone. It's just changed. So country performance metrics, there are different ways of measuring country performance. We've got research and development, how much money are they spending? there's a ranking called U21 that ranks national education systems with a variety of metrics. A predictor of how you're going to do later on is how are your students doing. So we've got PISA, which is international, and TIMSS, which comes from the US, and Hong Kong, Singapore, they both do very well. US is pretty pathetic. And the newest one is the World Intellectual Property Organization, and it now has a Global Innovation Index. Because, again, this is where we're going. This is just showing where output is coming from, and originally I had the US, but because China is fast approaching the US. But when I put the US in, you couldn't even see the differential between Singapore and Hong Kong. You know, and it doesn't mean either of these countries, they're doing very well. You know, they're at the top, but this is still where the output is coming from. So this is an example of the higher education ranking. Again, Singapore and Hong Kong are doing well, and they're moving up. China is obviously moving up as well, but it's still pretty far behind. A lot of the smaller Scandinavian countries that are homogeneous do well in this kind of ranking. And then QS decided to get in the game, and to get into their rankings, it's the number of institutions you have in a QS ranking. So China has a lot of institutions. So if you look at the numbers, it's completely opposite everybody else's rankings. You know, just be aware that it's out there, but don't use it. You've got to know what your country really wants as well. And a few people in this room probably know it. Most people don't. So sometimes when you're asked to do something that doesn't make sense to you or you don't want to do, it might be coming from way up there and you have no choice. So, you know, now Hong Kong is interesting here too. They're very open in putting out information. Anyone can go on the web and look at HKUST's last evaluation, the 2014 evaluation, anyone, anywhere, because they have the information out there. What they haven't been doing, however, is writing very much about higher education. So the best, I couldn't really find anything that updated the 2010 report on your aspirations, which was more about international, and of course they're saying the high rankings show that we're doing really well. So let's just review before we wind this conversation down. So these are the main rankers. QS 1,000, 50% is reputation. But if you're looking at subjects, good place to look because they're using different metrics. Times, 33%, only 200 get individual rankings. Their spin-offs don't show many differences. ARWU is now up to 800. Hong Kong finally exists in ARWU. It never did until this year. Congratulations. Nobel Prize winners, you know, how many Nobel Prize winners? It's just keep that in mind. US News has 1,000, 25% reputation, 45% size independent. Layton, no composite. You know, do your own. And then these other three as well. So they all have their strengths and their weaknesses. And I was asked yesterday, well, which is the best? And if I were looking for the best, I would cherry pick. Because each one has something that might be useful to me, but I'm not that happy with any of them or their weightings for my rankings. And tomorrow the library staff here is going to get a chance to do the Hong Kong UST rankings. They're going to be asked to come up with a set of rankings and weightings. So how to be number one at something? One of the things I always say in my articles is you've got to read the methodology. I know it's boring. I mean, nobody wants to read methodology, but you've got to know what they are doing in order to understand what you're seeing. You've got to drill down below the scores, and in some cases you'll see something like Explore, and if you click on Explore, you might get a little bit more data than you have if you're just looking at the rankings. You know, remember that you can't do anything about your size or your age or the subjects that you're special. I mean, you could change them, but this is what's important to you. the big three might not be the best rankings for you to be using. It's hard to convince people because they're the ones who publicize. Marketing. Focus on your strong subject, be consistent in your authors' names, list your articles, and work in an institution with government support to help you be number one. Now, I can say this here, I can't say this next week in Singapore. NTU. How did NTU suddenly become number one? Well, Singapore's a meritocracy, they say. And they pour loads of money into technology. So you put in your request for a grant in technology. Well, who's going to get it? NTU. Not the newer universities. So just to wrap it up, in the beginning we had arrows going up and down. In many cases now the arrows are only going down. That the push isn't from students or faculty, it's what does the government want you to be doing? And of course, how is that going to impact teaching and learning? And there's a lot of discussion about the impact this is going to have on teaching and learning in universities. And who's accountable to whom at this point. So I will leave you with this thought. And thank you very much.
Okay. So yes, thank you very much. And so now we can open the floor for questions. And my colleagues will be having the microphones to pass around. So please wait to use your microphone because this is also being videotaped. So, questions?
Yes.
Okay, here's the first.
My name is Anada Mishra. I'm a visiting research scholar. Yeah. I was wondering about the collaboration bit you spoke about, the importance it has, particularly the industry collaboration. So when you do collaborative research, does the collaboration with industry gets a higher weightage compared to collaboration with other academics or scholars?
Well, that's interesting. A lot of the rankings do not, even the ones looking at collaboration, are looking at, well, they're looking at citations.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't think they're dropping it out. I mean, it's, particularly if they're looking at collaboration between countries. So that certainly would be included. If they're only looking at collaboration between scholars at universities, then it might not be included. But you know, there are a lot of things that they're not factoring out because they wouldn't be looking at that. That's an interesting question, and I will try to follow up a little bit on that but I know that some of them are just looking at location. What's the location, and it's not the who, but the where.
So the industry collaboration per se doesn't get.
And it doesn't get much. I know if you saw, it's like 2.5% is the most that it ever gets. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was an interesting question. Some more, please. Don't be shy.
Thank you for your very informative presentation. You just now mentioned NTU Singapore. I had some working experience in NTU as well, and I hope you can share us what's your observation on NTU. You know, the Singapore government has lots of funding to both NUS and NTU.
Yes.
But by ranking, NTU overtakes NUS in some rankings.
That's right.
So apart from funding from governments, there must be some internal measurements, internal policies to rise the ranking. Can you comment, or you have any analysis?
I can comment a little bit. One of the things you're seeing in general is an NUS, a Hong Kong University, University of Tokyo, are all going down in the rankings. They're all, so on one advantage, they have age as their advantage, but more of the money is, and there's more flexibility in the newer schools. If you look at NTU, over the past 10 years, I think they've doubled the size of their faculty. And they were encouraged for a while by Singapore to hire more external faculty. There was a big push to bring people in from the outside. And then there was a pushback, not in the last election, but the one before that. People were really unhappy that it became too unfriendly. So there was a push. I actually taught there for a year. I taught a class for them. And I never quite understood why they're ranked quite so highly, quite honestly. But this is just a personal observation. But again, they're in the fields that are faster growing. They do have somewhat more flexibility. But yeah, they flip-flop their rankings back and forth. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but they have been allowed to grow. And the government, I mean, there were things SMU wanted to do, they weren't allowed to do. But it seems the things NTU wants to do, they seem to be allowed to do. But all the old-timers in the government are from NUS, so it's hard to explain that one as well.
Okay, thank you. More? Another question? Okay.
A very minor.
Well, one of the areas I've noticed that our university benefits is we're a young university.
Yes.
When do we stop being young from their perspective?
50.
What will the impact be? 50?
50.
Oh, we got a while to go.
Yes. That's the cutoff date. So some of the other Hong Kong universities have to watch out because they're suddenly going to drop out of this ranking, and it's not because they've done anything except gotten older.
Okay. More?
I have another one, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I was just wondering, is anybody thinking in terms of making a composite rank, taking bits of each of these rankings that you have shown, which will be of more value in some sense? Like, going back to the first question you asked, which one is the #1 university? Because each ranking gives a different university, but Harvard figures in many of them.
Yes.
But is it worthwhile looking at making a composite, like poll of polls or rank of ranks?
Yes, yeah,
List.
I did see one.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I don't remember, and somebody else asked me, has anyone ranked the rankers as well? But again, you've got to keep in mind that it's different metrics.
Yeah.
You know, so Rockefeller University, you know, #1, it has the best, highest percent of top articles, but nobody else even counts that. But yeah, it's not that difficult to do. I mean, there are in some of the articles when I've been doing updates, I do an update each year when the new rankings come out. I will look across and sometimes show differences. And it's usually, the top 10 don't vary, the top 20 certainly don't vary very much. The top 10 don't vary that much either. They might move around in terms of who's #1 this year. It could be MIT, it could be Harvard, it could be Stanford, it could be Oxford. And the two British rankers seem to do better. Oxford and Cambridge seem to do better in HKUST. I wonder why. You know, it's the same kind of thing as NTU. So at the top, it's pretty consistent. It really is. You might find, you know, 20 universities making up the top 10 across 10 different rankings. I've always thought it would be interesting to look at what happens in the middle. Never really have gotten there, but probably, one thing I did with the US ranking, Wall Street Journal and Times came out with a ranking of US colleges. They are looking at trying to find metrics for teaching. So they were experimenting with a new ranking. And for that, because it was US and I'm so familiar with it, I did look at the middle. But it would be, that's where the movement really is. The bottom kind of stays the bottom for a long time. The top stays the top for a long time. It's what's happening in the middle. And it also depends whether the middle schools are even getting a rank or not. You know, because some of them, everybody gets a rank. And some of them, you just get this aggregate. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you, Ruth, for sharing all this very useful information to us. I just have an observation that it seems like there are more and more of those ranking thing coming up. You know, in the beginning, it probably is just one or two, but as what you have introduced, there's so many of them. And I thought that probably there's a market for those ranking because students love to see those ranking. Parents too,
Yes.
because that's a yardstick for parents sending their children to which university. Like Hong Kong is so small, but we have 8 of us. And then people will say, why Hong Kong U? Why Chinese U? Or why UST? Because they're ranked high, you know, that kind of thing. And then sometimes we also see that sometimes when you ask the administrator of different university, they always say, oh, we don't care too much about ranking. But we are happy when we were ranked high. But they were asked, you know, when our rank drops, they said, why? All of a sudden, you know, how come our rank drops? So, so that's why there's a lot of pressure from different universities to look at the ranking and then push the faculty to do good as well too, right?
Yes.
Just an observation,
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay, would you like to respond to that, or do we want to?
No, I mean, yeah, there are more of them coming out, and they all say they're serving a different purpose. You know, so if you're only interested in papers, you might look at NTU or Layton, right? But QS and THE specifically say it's for students and their parents. You know, that they make it very clear that that's their target market. You know, and then some of the ones in between are, I guess, trying to, and they don't even publicize that much. You know, so something like SkyMago or Layton, they write a lot, they're doing a lot of research, they're writing articles, they're getting citations from creating these rankings. You know, so that everybody has their own purpose.
Okay, thank you. Further questions?
They're very quiet.
What about Google Scholar that you
Okay.
mentioned at the beginning?
Okay. Google Scholar used to be terrible. No, I mean, no question. You know, they couldn't differentiate a citation from a letter that you wrote to your friend, as long as a name appeared in it. So that they have been getting better in terms of what they're doing. And, you know, they have their own metrics. We didn't talk about H-index at all, which is another measure that's being used. And so they are getting better. But they still don't have a way of, I don't know how you feel about peer review. Yeah. You know, or quality. I mean, that, you know, so I guess I'm an old timer. Quality is important to me. So you just don't know. So yeah, it's picking up on something that might be in a repository that's been cited, a working paper. So it does have a place, I think, at this point, just to get a feel for other, you know, if other things that are being cited as well. If you're following yourself, I think it's helpful to know who's looking at your works and who cited you beyond the regular sources. Does it fit in the rankings or not? Again, it depends on how you feel about what makes a quality university, what makes a quality university. Is it the number of times you're out there, or is it some other standards that you're placing? And I can't make those decisions. I mean, I know somebody whose university made all the faculty do YouTubes. Not because it was going to be ranked, but as a way to publicize, and also as a way to bring in industry and make things more accessible to the general public. So that was nice, but it's not going to affect their rankings. But somebody might cite it, and it would then show up. Yeah, and then it would show up in Google Scholar. So that they are playing around. They're making very clear that what they are doing is beta testing different ways of using Google Scholar. So you know, but they're making, you know, they're not no bones about it. We're trying this out, and they've been doing it for a few years now. Yes, absolutely, you can't ignore it. I mean, when it first came out, young scholars were so happy because they say, look, I have so many citations, and I have so few here. And it's, well, who are these citations? It could have been your syllabus. So I know some faculty member said to me, he'd rather have his article in a syllabus and have 100 students looking at it and maybe learning something from it than having people who are already in his field who know what he's doing and are all knowing the same thing read it. You know, so we all have our different perspectives.
Okay, great. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left, so maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. Okay.
Yes, Louis.
So, what do you think about the social media metrics, for example, metrics or the prompts? So, is this growing important in the future?
Again, it's philosophy, you know, and it probably is important not so much for the metrics as for the survival of universities. No, seriously, if funding is being cut back in places, which it is, then you need to be showing how am I helping my country, for example. You know, do I have a presence that goes beyond the ivory tower? So I think that is important, that you should be out there, you should be sharing your work, you should be making it accessible. Does it fit into a ranking of where the university is going at this point or not? I can't answer that, you know, because there's no problem. But I think it is something that's important. But again, you have enough pressures, faculty have enough pressure between teaching and learning. I mean, should they really be sitting there and tweeting? Of course, the president of the US has nothing else to do. Sorry. But, so if he has enough time to tweet, I guess you all have enough time to tweet as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, another question.
Well, you touched a little bit, Layton, on geopolitical and how everything seems to have moved to a top-down type of push. I think a lot of my concern about where metrics are going relates to that, not so much the politics per se, but that the fact appears to me to be that rankings are more and more only being used as a chess beating exercise and competing for funding, which is important, but not as a feedback mechanism for improving scholarship, research, and teaching, which seems to be getting lost. And does that perception match up with your research?
Yeah, I mean that's what I perceive, and that's why that's why I tell people that they have to look beyond the rankings. That you look at the numbers and you say, okay, so I'm not doing as well in faculty staff ratio. Is that a problem? Is it not a problem? Only you know that, for example. You know, and is it really impacting teaching? So no, that is one of my big concerns, and I think it's a big concern of the people who are writing in the higher education literature. I mean, you don't see many people embracing the rankings in the higher education literature. They're very concerned with how are students benefiting from all of this, if at all. You know, so there's a lot of criticism out there, there's a lot of concern out there, but it doesn't seem to be making a difference at this point. Now, everything has its trends, so maybe this too shall pass.
Or we'll shift
Or not.
to something else will come up.
Yeah, something else that could be worse. It could be worse.
Oh, God. Well, with the tweeter in chief, yeah.
All right, well, on that, well, let's not quite end on that note.
It could be better, okay, it could be better.
Well, thank you all for coming, and we really appreciate it, and let's all thank Ruth for this really fascinating talk. Really, really appreciate it, and so you all have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.